We're having one of those mornings. Technology isn't our friend, and I don't know what happened to our musician. So we're going to see if he can sing a cappella when a time comes. Fortunately, there are no new songs, so we can see how that goes. And I hope Frank's okay, because he's very reliable. So, welcome. Glad you found something to do on a rainy Sunday day. Tēnā koutou te whānau o Auckland Unitarian. Tēnā koutou nā manahiri. No mai, haramai ki tēnei whare karakia a te atua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, our live stream's working, so I want to welcome all those who are far away, who are coming, and all of you to our sanctuary. This morning, I want to reflect on questions by Jay Wolin asked us about what kind of people are we? Are we a people of holding on or of letting go? Holding on to rigid ideas or letting go and opening our minds and hearts to something new? Holding on to a certainty of how things should be, or letting go and living with the uncertainty of new ways of being in the world? Holding on to what makes us comfortable, or letting go so we may grow, which can be uncomfortable. Holding on to what makes us safe, letting go to make room to help others feel safe. With this flame, this symbol of our religion, let it be a symbol of burning up the ties that hold us back from being our true self and reaching our true potential. Let it be a symbol of lighting a new way for us into a better tomorrow. And let it be a symbol of letting go, because holding on too long and too tightly is never good for the soul. Dag Hammarskjöld once said, each morning we must hold out the chalice of our being to receive, to carry, and give back. Each morning we hold our chalice of being to be filled with the graces of life that abound, air to breathe, food to eat, companions to love, beauty to behold, art to cherish, causes to serve. They come in ritual processions. Lost my place, sorry. They come in ritual processions, these gifts of life. Whether we deserve them, we cannot know or say, for they are poured out for us. Our task is to hold steady the chalice of our being. We carry the chalice with us as we go, either meandering aimlessly or with destination in our eye. We share its abundance if we have any sense, reminding others as we remind ourselves of the contents of the chalice we don't deserve. Water from living streams fills it, if only we hold that out faithfully. We give back, if we can, something of ourselves. Some love, some beauty, some grace, some gift. We give back in gratitude, if we can. Something like that is poured into our chalice of being for those who abide with us and will follow. Each morning we hold out the chalice of our being to receive, to carry, to give back. Would you please join me in the covenant of our congregation in your order of service? Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is the sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony. Thus do we covenant with each other and with our God. Okay, who wants to lead us in the spirit of life? You know it. Found a pretty cool story today. Have you ever made a quilt? You have? Not an easy task, is it? You have to be somewhat patient. But I have a story called The Quilt Maker's Gift, which, any of those quilt patterns look familiar? Yeah? What'd you do with the quilt when you were done? Gave it to a friend who had a baby. You too? Yeah, quilts were made to give away. And that's kind of what this story says. There was once a quilt maker who kept a house in the blue, misty mountains up high. Even the oldest, greatest great-grandfather could not recall a time when she was not up there, sewing away day after day. Here and there, and wherever the sun warmed the earth, it was said she made the prettiest quilts anyone had ever seen. The blues seemed to come from the deepest part of the ocean, the whites from the northernmost snows, the greens and purples from the abundant wildflowers, the reds, oranges, and pinks from the most wonderful sunsets. Some said there was a magic in her fingers. Some whispered that her needle and cloth were gifts of the bewitched. And still others said the quilts really fell to earth from the shoulders of passing angels. Many people climbed her mountains, pockets bursting with gold, hoping to buy one of the wonderful quilts. But the woman would not sell them. I give my quilts to those who are poor or homeless, she told all who knocked on her door. They are not for the rich. On the darkest and coldest nights, the woman would make her way down the mountain to the town below. There she would wander the cold cobblestone streets until she came upon someone sleeping outside in the chill. She would then take a newly finished quilt from her bag, wrap it around their shivering shoulders, tuck them in tight, and tiptoe away. Then the very next morning, with a streaming cup of blackberry tea, she would begin a new quilt. And now at this time, there also lived a very powerful and greedy king who liked nothing better than to receive presents. The hundreds of thousands of beautiful quilts he got for Christmas, beautiful gifts he got for Christmas and his birthday were never enough. So a law was passed that the king would celebrate his birthday twice a year. When the king still wasn't when that still wasn't enough, he ordered his soldiers to search the kingdom for those few people who had not yet given him a gift. Over the years, the king had come to own almost all the prettiest things in the world. Throughout the castle, from top to bottom, in drawers and on shelves, in boxes and trunks, in closets and sacks, all of the king's countless things were stashed. Things that shimmered and glittered and glowed, things whimsical and practical, things mysterious and magical, so many, many things that the king kept a list of all the lists of things he owned. And yet, with all these marvelous treasures to enjoy, the king never smiled. He was not happy at all. Somewhere there must be one beautiful thing that will finally make me happy. He was often heard to say, "And I will have it." One day, a soldier rushed into the palace with news about a magical quilt maker who lived in the mountains. The king stamped his foot. "And how is that this person has never given me one of her quilts as a gift?" he demanded. "She only makes them for the poor, Your Majesty," the soldier replied, "and she will not sell them for any amount of money." "Well, we shall see about that," the king roared. "Bring me a horse and 1,000 soldiers," and they set off in search of the quilt maker. And when they arrived at her home, the quilt maker merely laughed. "My quilts are for the poor and needy, and I can easily see that you are neither." "I want one of those quilts," the king demanded. "It might be the one thing that will finally make me happy." The woman thought for a moment. "Make presents of everything you own," she said, "and then I'll make a quilt for you. With each gift that you give, I'll sew in another piece. When at last all your things are gone, your quilt will be finished." "Give away all my wonderful treasures?" cried the king. "I don't give things away, I take them." And with that, he ordered his soldiers to seize the beautiful star quilt from the quilt maker. But when they rushed upon her, she tossed the quilt out the window, and a great gust of wind carried it up, and away. The king was now very angry. He marched the woman down through the town and up another mountain where he had his royal iron maker shape a thick bracelet of iron. Then they chained her to a rock in the cave of a sleeping bear. Once more the king asked her for a quilt, and once more she refused. Very well then, the king replied, I'll leave you here, and when the bear wakes, I'm sure he will make a very fine breakfast of you. Not a very nice king, huh? Later, when the bear's eyes opened, and he saw the woman in his cave, he stood on his mighty hind legs and gave a roar that rattled her bones. She looked up at him and sadly shook her head. It's no wonder you're so grouchy, the quilt maker said. You've nothing but rocks on which to rest your head at night. Bring me an armful of pine needles, and with my shawl I'll make you a great big pillow. And that is what she did. No one had ever been so kind to the bear before. So he broke the iron bracelet and asked her to spend the night. Although the king was very good at being greedy, he was very bad at being mean. All that night he could not sleep for thinking about the poor woman in the cave. Oh my, what have I done, he wailed. So he woke up his soldiers, and they all marched in their pajamas up to the cave to save her. But when they arrived, the king found the quilt maker and the bear having a breakfast of berries and honey. Now the king completely forgot about feeling sorry and became angry all over again. He ordered the royal island makers to build an island barely big enough for the woman and to stand on her tiptoes. Once again, the king asked her for a quilt, and once again she said no. Very well, the king replied. Tonight, when you're too tired to stand and lie down to sleep, you'll drown. And the king left her alone on the tiny island. Shortly after he left, the quiltmaker saw a sparrow flying across the Great Lake. A cold, fierce wind, a cold, fierce wind was blowing, and it did not look like the poor bird would make it to shore. The quiltmaker called to him, and he stopped to rest on her shoulder. The poor, tired sparrow was shivering, so the woman quickly made him a coat from scraps of her purple vest. When he was warmed and the wind had stopped, the bird flew off, but he was very grateful to the quiltmaker for what she had done. Soon the sky darkened as the air filled with huge clouds of sparrows, thousands of wings beating together. They swooped down, lifted the woman in their little beaks, and carried her safely to shore. Again that night, the king could not sleep for thinking about the woman alone on the island. Oh my, what have I done? He moaned. So he woke up his sleepy soldiers again, and they marched in their pajamas down to the lake to set the woman free. But when they arrived, she was sitting on a tree limb, sewing tiny purple coats for all the sparrows. I give up, the king shouted. What must I do for you to give me a quilt? As I said, the woman answered, give away all the things you own, and I'll sew a quilt for you. And with each gift that you give, I'll add another piece to your quilt. I can't do that, cried the king. I love all my wonderful, beautiful things. But if they don't make you happy, the woman replied, what good are they? That's true, the king sighed. He thought about what she said for a long, long time, and so long that the weeks went by. Oh, all right, he finally muttered. If I must give away my treasures, then I must. The king went to his castle and searched from top to bottom for something he could bear to give away. Frowning, he finally came out with a single marble But the boy who received it smiled so brightly in return, the king went back for 5 more things. Eventually, he brought out a pile of velvet coats and went about the town giving them to people, dressed only in rags. All were so pleased that they marched up and down the street in a grand parade. Still, the king did not smile. Next, the king fetched 100 waltzing blue Siamese cats. That's pretty special, huh? And the dozen fish that were clear as glass. When the king ordered his merry-go-round with the real horses to be brought out, children cried with delight and cartwheeled around him, and just the smallest of smiles began to show on the king's face. The king looked about him and saw the dancing and merrymaking and all the happiness his gifts had brought. A child took hold of his hand and pulled him into the dance. Now the king really smiled and even laughed out loud. "How can this be?" he cried. "How can I feel so happy about giving my things away? Bring everything out. Bring it all out at once." Meanwhile, the quilt maker kept her word and started making a special quilt for the king. With each gift that he gave, she added to his quilt. And so the king kept on giving and giving. When at last there was no one left in town who had not received something, the king decided to go out into the world and find others who might be in need of his gifts. But before he left, the king promised the quilt maker he would send a sparrow back to her each and every time he gave something away. Morning, noon, and night, the woman rolled out of town. The wagons rolled out of town, each piled high with the king's wonderful things. And for years and years, messenger sparrows flew to the quilt maker's windowsill as the king slowly emptied his wagon, trading his treasures for smiles around the world. On and on the quilt maker worked, and piece by piece, the king's quilt grew more and more beautiful. Finally, one day, a weary sparrow flew into her window and perched on her needle. She knew then and there that it was the last messenger. So she put a final stitch in the quilt and started down the mountain in search of the king. After a long search, she finally found him. The king's royal clothes were now in tatters, and his toes poked out of his boots. Yet his eyes glittered with joy, and his laugh was wonderful and thunderous. The quilt maker unfolded the king's quilt from her bag. It was so beautiful that the hummingbirds and butterflies fluttered about. Standing on tiptoes, she tenderly wrapped it around him. "What's this?" cried the king. "As I promised you long ago," the woman said, "when the day came that you yourself were poor, only then would I give you a quilt." The king's great sunny laugh made green apples fall and flowers turn his way. "But I am not poor," he said. "I may look poor, but in truth, my heart is full to bursting, filled with memories of all the happiness I've given and received. I'm the richest man I know." Nevertheless, the quilt maker said, "I made this quilt just for you." "Thank you," replied the king. "I'll take it, but only if you'll accept a gift from me. There is one last treasure I have left to give away. All these years I've used it just for you. I've saved it just for you." And from his rickety, run-down wagon, the king brought out his throne. "It's really quite comfortable," the king said, "and just the thing for the long days of sewing. From that day on, the king often came to the quiltmaker's house in the clouds. By day, the quiltmaker sewed the beautiful quilts she would not sell, and at night, the king took them down to the town. There he searched out the poor and downhearted, never happier than he was giving something away. And there's a tired quiltmaker. Pretty good story, huh? Pretty beautiful pictures. Do you have a joy or concern you'd like to give away? No? Well, again, a cappella, we'll sing You Away. Somebody start. Lost track of where we are. Oh, it's time for joys and concerns. So let us take this time to light a candle, share your name, and whatever joy or concern you'd like. Remember, somebody might be watching you as you give it, so don't offend your family or friends while you're lighting a candle.
He died on the shortest day, and at the beginning of Matariki, which fitted with my dad because he was very much the astronomer and the scientist, and he'd be out there watching Halley's Comet and the moons of all the different types and the stars. So to die on the shortest day and at the beginning of Matariki, which is the time that is traditionally associated with remembering the dead, is just fits with who my dad was. And I would also say that my dad went gracefully and beautifully. So my mum never had to put him into care, and she couldn't have done that. So he must have known secretly in himself, even though he was suffering from such terrible dementia. But yeah, it was just right how it all came together. And I remember my dad and thinking of him particularly with a shirt. So I was in an op shop on the day that he had been dead a year, and my husband saw this on the rack, and he said, "There's a shirt over there you want to go and get because it's $2." And he said, "It just says to me something about your dad." So yeah, I remember my dad.
Morena, my name is Shireen. This is a candle of joy to welcome Rana and Peter, who are with us this morning. I met them both about 3 years ago at Rana's hearing, and Peter and some of his humanist friends had come up to support Rana from Wellington. And here is Peter again, coming up and staying with Rana. Rana has now been given a work permit, or so he's been told, but it hasn't actually appeared yet. So this is also a candle of hope, Rana, that your work permit will arrive very soon.
Good morning, I'm David, and I'd like to light a candle of joy. It was sparked by Muslim man contacting me this week. His name is Arif Rashid, who spoke at this church a couple of years ago after the Christchurch bombings. He represents Muslim people in court, and I was staggered why he would ring me to thank. He thanked me for listening to his story. That's what he rang for, and I was sort of amazed why he would thank me 2 years later. And the reason was he was in the news in the middle of last week for walking out of a government conference that was called to discuss security for Muslims following the Christchurch attack. And they did have this conference and had not listened to Muslim points of view at all. Muslims don't want security to be beefed up. They want to be understood. And so I had helped him by inviting him here, but also I was able to tell him that the government has done something that Muslims would appreciate. They have, 2 years ago, also after the Christchurch attack, they had started a conversation about bringing religious education into state schools. And I know from my experience that report reached a conclusion last December. A report was prepared with suggestions what to do about education, but it has not been published. And Chris Hipkins has not even mentioned the subject for the past 2 years. And I asked for a copy of that report under the Official Information Act last October, and I was told by the ministry, basically, get lost, this is none of your business. And so I complained this week to the Minister, Chris Hipkins, and said it is urgent that you do listen to our story, and I'm quoting Rashid as part of my support. And I've also started a website to air this and other issues, and Rashid has agreed to help me get Muslim people to support my website. So very complicated story because it's a very complicated issue, but that was a real high in my whole experience.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Rachel. This is a candle of concern for COVID and the people who are kept apart by it. My daughter was due to fly tonight to Christchurch so that she could visit her grandpa in Timaru, who has terminal cancer, and they just closed the borders, so she won't be able to go probably. Yeah.
I like this kind of for all those joys and concerns that we carry in our hearts and minds, but are unspoken. I know you know this song, but you might need a couple of strong voices to start it off. So let us give it a go. Who's going to volunteer to be up front so we all start at the same time? The Auckland Unitarian Ad Hoc Choir.
Your
Nicely done. Thank you. My reading begins with a quote by Marianne Williamson. In every community, there is work to be done. In every nation, there are wounds to heal. In every heart, there is power to do it. I like this story because it takes place where my first church was many years ago, in Buffalo, New York. Not atypical of Buffalo, there's a vacant house next door, and not atypical of vacant houses. It has a garage with a missing window. It became home to woodchucks, skunks, and cats. I recognize the first two as forces of nature, but cats are invasive. When I moved into my house, the neighbors told me that a former occupant had fed the feral cats. Yeah, not me. I'm a bird lover. Feral cats decimate songbird populations. We are not pleased, but we are patient. This is a texture of an urban environment. I felt more inclined to live with it than change it. Peering out the window one morning, we saw kittens bounding through the yard. A tabby watched them. Oh, I thought, the feral cat begets more cats. A colleague referred me to a local nonprofit which advises the community on humane ways to deal with feral cats. They call it trap, neuter, vaccinate, release. You trap cats, bring them for spaying and neutering. The vets vaccinate them and you bring them back. Okay, I thought, if it needs to be done, let's do it. So I began to trap the feral cats. This is not something I foresaw myself doing. I borrowed the traps, used time off from work to get them to the appointments, cared for them in my garage, and released them when it was time. It was a process that took 3 weeks. Training them to go into the traps meant that we've started feeding them and giving them water. The kittens went through growth spurts. After releasing 2 males and watching one of them stick around, I realized that I've accidentally become the caretaker of this colony. Our decision to be the neighbors who take the lead on this problem means that we will now own it in our own community. Part of being in community is noticing what's needed. Part of being in community is doing what is necessary but unclaimed. Being part of community means being willing to own what might not be easy or comfortable. I also learned that being part of community means being willing to own one's power, which required me to stretch beyond what I thought I'd be willing to do. My musings. I entitled it A Letting Go People. How good are you at letting go? Personally, I find it a bit of a struggle. Even when it involves letting go of negative things in my life. There are plenty of things to practice on. I think of derogatory or critical things people in authority, parents, teachers, coaches, ministers, said to me that I let define or limit me. I can think of things I didn't try, or insufferable things I endured, or bad choices I made because I didn't let go of those diminishing words. If I ever find out who instilled in me that my purpose in life was to meet others' expectations, I have a few choice words I want to share. Yet I have to ask myself why I didn't let go of something so toxic to my well-being long ago. It took someone I loved and trusted to point out the obvious before I could let go and be fully my authentic self. It is letting go of the positive aspects of our life that is most challenging. Letting go of those things requires accepting change. None of us welcomes that, for letting go can leave us stuck in grief. No one wants to go there, so we hold on tight. The things we are holding on to tightest because we can't imagine life without them are in truth our fears. Instead of letting go of them, we hoard fears' illusions that blind us to a life worth living. In my musings about just how do we let go when it is so difficult, I was surprised by an insight that it might be accomplished by living a generous life. Let me offer two stories that make the case. The first is quite personal, and many of you shared a part of it. After 4 years together, something unexpected happened while Rachel and I were enjoying our summer break. We decided to get married to celebrate 5 happy years. Not a big deal. I hear lots of people do it. But it was for us. One of us had a less than ideal record of successful relationships. The other was reasonably suspicious of the patriarchal aspects of the institution of marriage itself. I think you could sort out who had what fears. For reasons I still don't quite understand, we felt a need that summer in the Bay of Islands to commit an act of generosity by publicly giving ourselves to each other in marriage. To do so, we had to let go. I had to let go of fear of failure. She had to let go of her fear of the institution. Making the decision was free. And at first, felt like the end of the story, except for planning the wedding. Easy peasy. Acts of generosity, turns out, don't have a use-by date. They take on a life of their own. As we thought about the wedding, we realized what would make us happiest would be making it a gift to those we love, be they family or childhood friends or those we share our passions with in our Unitarian congregation or our colleagues in the union movement. We wanted to throw them a great party. We wanted a party that was not about celebrating a bride and groom, but the communities we support and which have supported us. I've heard planning weddings can be a source of stress. For us, it was a source of joy, except for worrying about how we were going to squeeze everyone into the sanctuary. When the day came, one of the highlights was seeing the two communities of which we are part commingle. The laughing, dancing, eating, and drinking together. It was a great wedding gift, courtesy of generosity. There was one challenging question we had to decide before sending the invitations. That was what to do about wedding presents. In blending in our lives, we already had 2 of everything. We certainly didn't want 3. Our first thought was simply to ask on the invitation for no presents, please. Then it occurred to us, who are we to deprive others of the joy of generosity? So we invite our guests to make a monetary gift that would be shared equally between our Peace and Social Justice Committee and Union Aid, an organization that funds programs to enable people throughout our Asia-Pacific region to have decent work, giving them and their families the opportunity to live in dignity and free of poverty. while we weren't surprised by our guest's generosity, it still far exceeded our expectations. That generosity allowed for many acts of generosity to children, the disabled, the homeless, the oppressed, the impoverished, the sick, and so many more. As generosity begets generosity, who knows how far that initial act of generosity, Rachel and I thought we were just making to each other, has reached. All it required was letting go. Perhaps that story makes the point sufficiently, but I found another this week I can't let go of without sharing it first. The Reverend Daniel Cantor tells this story. He tells two stories, one very brief. There's an old story about a man who was dying, who called his family together and said to them he believed they were wrong, that he could take it with him. So sell everything, and when he died, they were to bury him with the cash. They thought he was crazy, but they did it, and he died, and went up to the hereafter, and there the angels met him at the gate, and he said, "Here I am, and here's all my money." They told him cash didn't matter at all. They only took receipts. There was an old woman who may have heard that story and found it amusing. She had more than she needed and certainly didn't want to take it with her. Her children had grown and passed on, but she had been a teacher, so she had many children she loved. In her retirement, she loved to grow tomatoes. She watched as her tomatoes grew and some made it to the table and to her neighbor's table. Others, like some of her students, fell to nothing. But she thought a long time about that, and watching her tomatoes on days she couldn't hoist her body out of the garden, they fell. And as she watched them drop, she realized they weren't wasted just because they didn't end up in a salad. They were seeding the next generation by planting themselves in the self-nourishing pile of rotting tomatoes. Her neighbors would say she let the drops go to waste. Mr. Davis, who came by once a week from the church and mostly talked about his life, would say she ought to collect them. But she was through with oughts and shoulds. She was enjoying the notion that some of her crop would feed her friends and some the soil. So she called her, while not listening to Mr. Davis wax on, she had a thought: what if my life is like those tomatoes? Once I fed many with my words and lessons, but now I'm more like the fruit that hits the ground. Could I still have something to give? So she called her financial advisor. He said she was crazy and she would starve, and she said she would get along. So she sold everything, even her house, with one condition: that she could live in a garden shed which had a room for a bed and running water, and that she could continue to grow her tomatoes. The children of the family that bought the house came to see her, curious about the resident in their backyard and the garden. She showed them how to tie up the vines and prune the leaves so they let the sun in. They helped her dig the soil, and they brought her vegetables they harvested. And her days passed by watching the garden grow and the children learn. The neighbors thought she'd lost her mind and stopped coming by, including Mr. Davis, she thought thankfully. When she died, the children and the family scattered her ashes in with the tomato plants as she wanted. And then one day, a few weeks later, they got a box just addressed to the house, no name on it. Inside the box were thousands of letters, all addressed to the old woman. They were thank you letters from children They were from children who were students at a school in a rough part of town where the woman had grown up. They wrote to say how grateful they were to the older woman for creating such a perfect school where they could learn how to grow plants and study math and English and peace studies. You see, the old woman had sold everything she owned and created the school where it was needed most. And she had passed on 2 charters, that the school, 1, always had to have a garden to teach children how to grow things, and 2, that they used the curriculum she had developed over 50 years of teaching social studies on how to make peace. Many of the letters had pictures children drew of faces on tomatoes and larger-than-life stink bugs eating corn. The family decided that to honor the old woman, they had one more thing to do. So they took the box of letters and stapled every single one of them on the walls and ceiling of the shed. So the inside looked like a jewel box decorated by crayon drawings and cards of smiling vegetables and happy slugs. And then the family invited the school to come visit them. And one class at a time came and marveled at the shed as they found their cards on the walls and they toured the garden and could name every plant. Then they sat on the porch and heard the story of the founder of their school who sold everything for them. You look like a bright crowd. So this is not a story that requires explanation. It's just a reminder that letting go is a lifelong journey made possible by our acts of generosity. Amen. Because of time and technology, we're going to pass on the closing hymn. So let us extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And these are my closing words. In the end, it won't matter how much we have, but how generously we have given. It won't matter how much we know, but rather how well we live. And it won't matter how much we believe, but how deeply we love. I will invite those who have notices to come forward and help themselves to the mic that I need. And then please break down into small groups. You'll find a conversation starter. Get you going.
Push the little button on the left.
No, we're just going to have music practice again at 11:45 for those who want to learn the new song, We Shall Be Known. And that can be anybody, but I know it's a fairly select group of us who will be joining together to do it. So let's go. Here we go.
Anyway, we're going to be gathering photographs, and we are working on fun of but it'll be a film night. And what we'd like to do is invite everybody to take photographs of people having fun being Unitarians. And the purpose of these photographs will be ultimately to have some on the website, to have some for a slideshow that we're hoping to develop to have during tea time, to have some for a sign in front of the church or for a sign in the foyer. And the idea was to send all of these photographs, Paul, to our Google Drive, which did you
Sort
figure
it
out?
out.
You figured it out? Oh, how do I see that?
It's not doable yet, but I'll sort it out.
You'll sort it out, okay. And once Paul sorts it out, hopefully Rachel can announce it in the newsletter where to send the photographs. The idea was that rather than hire somebody to take professional photographs, we thought we could just collate the ones that we get from the congregation and go through them all and pick and choose.